If you know anything about differentials, you can probably recognize that this is not looking good. I pulled into a parking spot the other day and lost all drive to the rear wheels. I locked the center diff and drove home with the front wheels, and now I have to figure out what the problem is. The first step is to see if the axles are broken. That would be the easiest fix, but it looks like we aren't that lucky. Axles look fine, so now I have to pull the differential. I'd say that's the issue. Old Discoveries and Defenders have what's known as a 2-pin differential, which is actually one pin that holds 2 of the planetary gears. That pin is held in place by 2 small circlips, and I'm willing to bet one of those clips fell off, allowing the gears to just fall into the axle housing. In my case, that pin broke into 3 pieces, which probably bounced around in the axle for a bit too. Ideally, I can clean this up, replace the center section with a locking differential, and be back on the road pretty quickly. Now that the differential carrier is out, I can remove the ring gear, which I plan on reusing. Looking at the ring gear more closely though, it's clear that it got a bit banged up by those loose chunks of metal. If I need a new ring and pinion gears, I might as well get a gear ratio that will suit the 33-inch tires I have. And if I do that, I might as well put some kind of traction device in the front as well. And I guess that's how these things happen. One minute you're thinking, hey, the disco is pretty much done. I guess I can start thinking about the Porsche, or the Volvo, or the other disco. And the next minute you're ordering overnight parts from the UK, knowing that this next round of modifications is going to drastically change the scope of the disco project. New gears and bearings means fully stripping down the diff housing, which is pretty straightforward. I've already removed the differential itself, and now I'm pulling the pinion gear and its bearings. After that, I just need to tap the pinion bearing races out. There are 2 small notches in the housing to allow you to tap the races out with a punch. This is a larger inner race, which has a shim behind it. We'll need a decent selection of these shims to set the pinion height, which I'll get into later. I'm really glad I didn't just slap a locker in here, because there are a ton of metal shavings that would have pretty quickly destroyed any new parts. I don't know about you, but I'm a visual learner, so seeing the pinion all stacked up like this is helpful to me. I'm also putting it here for future me to remember how to reassemble it. I guess this is a good time to say this. If you like this kind of content or any of my other videos, consider subscribing. I do enjoy making these, and I'd be even more motivated if I knew people were watching them. I haven't heard many others talking about it, but this one simple trick will save you a ton of time later on. I'm slightly reducing the outer diameter of these old races so they can easily slip into the housing, instead of needing to be pressed in. Since setting the pinion height involves some trial and error, I figure I'd rather be able to remove the race by hand to swap shims. I should note that I also did this to the outer race, but that was completely unnecessary. Since I'll be installing an electronic locker in this housing, it'll need a hole for the wires. This is an easy task as long as you pick a good spot for the hole. I've chosen an excellent spot right here. This particular housing is now absolutely filled with metal shavings, so I'll pressure wash it clean. With the housing drilled and clean, I guess I can show you the new parts we're going to use. The rear differential is a Terrafirma TF450 e-locker. As I've said before, Terrafirma doesn't have the best reputation for quality, but I've been reasonably happy with their stuff so far. But the real reason I got this is that it's the only electronic locker on the market, and I didn't want to mess with airlines. The front diff is an Ashcroft ATB or automatic torque biasing differential. It's basically a limited slip. People will have opinions on the locker in the back and the ATB up front, but my thought is that when the rear is locked up, I'll have the most traction with the lowest likelihood of blowing up a CV or a front axle. This is all new to me though, so we'll just have to see for ourselves. Perhaps the most exciting part of this project is the new gearing. With 33s, the disco is painfully slow and borderline dangerous on a mountain highway. These 437s should make a big difference on and off-road, and when I inevitably switch to 35s, this gear ratio should still be acceptable. If you're trying to figure out which ratio to get for your own Land Rover, the Ashcroft ratio calculator is great. You can see here that at 70 miles an hour I was only turning 2200 RPMs with the stock 354s. The 437s will put me at about 2700, which is exactly what they recommend. Installing the differential bearings is really easy as long as you have a press and an assortment of bearing drivers. The only thing to note is that you want to press on the inner race, not the bearing cage itself. Spinning the bearing a little bit while pressing it down will tell you if you're doing it right. The pinion bearing is equally straightforward, but you'll need to find a 1.5 inch ID thick wall pipe or something similar. Putting a new ring gear onto a new differential should be pretty easy, but the gear doesn't fit over the electromagnetic switch thing on the e-locker. After a struggle with this spring clip, I removed the parts that were in the way and the gear slipped on. I did throw the gear on the grill at about 350 degrees for a couple minutes to get it to expand and fit onto the carrier, and that worked perfectly. And now it smells like hot dogs. In my haste to check the bolt alignment before the gear cooled, I almost lost some of these pins. I'd recommend putting the switch back together before flipping it over.
Fuck. Damn.
Now that it's back together, I can use blue Loctite on all the bolts and torque them to 70 Newton meters according to the instructions. The next check we need to do is ring gear run out. These threaded nuts are used to set both the differential bearing end play and the backlash. For now, they just need to be wound in tight enough to prevent the diff from moving side to side. Turning these by hand is dumb. I'd recommend a pin spanner or just making your own out of a piece of bar stock and some bolts. The max allowable run out is 7 thousandths, and with a test indicator, I'm getting about 4 thousandths. I'd expect a brand new ring gear and differential to be pretty good, as long as both mating surfaces are really clean. The pinion height is simply how far into the diff housing the pinion gear is. Since the ring gear rotates around a fixed point, setting the pinion correctly is the only way to get the gears to mesh properly. Like I said earlier, the height is adjusted with shims under the race, and since we made that brilliant dummy race, this should go smoothly. I was a bit surprised to find that the Land Rover pinion uses a nut and the Ashcroft one needs a bolt, but doesn't come with one. I just went out and picked up a couple M12 by 175 grade 10 bolts, and those should be fine. From this angle, you can see the smaller dummy race that I made. It keeps sliding out, which isn't helpful at all. I should have just pressed in the new outer race when I started doing the pinion. We don't have to worry too much about the bearing preload at this point, but it shouldn't have any noticeable play. Land Rover specifies 39.5 millimeters from the face of the pinion to the bottom of the bearing journals, but I don't have a good way to measure that. But I found out that the face of the pinion to the top of the journals should be exactly 3 inches. I happen to have this 1-2-3 block and a straight edge, so that's what I'll shoot for. With a straight edge resting on the 3-inch block, there's about a 4/1000 gap at the bearing cap surface. This means that our shim is 4/1000 too thick. This shim is 54/1000, so we need to come up with some combination of shims that adds up to 50/1000. Luckily, I ordered the shim kit from Ashcroft, so we have a bunch of options. I kind of can't believe how well that worked. After one try, the pinion is exactly 3 inches below the bearing cap mating surface. Now it needs to come back out so the new races can be pressed in. I should mention that it's really important to keep the races with the bearings they came with. That's why I've written stuff all over these orange Timken boxes. Also, the old races are perfect for pressing in the new ones. You obviously don't want to have anything contact the tapered bearing surfaces. These are our 2 Pinion Height shims totaling 50/1000. We'll just double check this and it looks like we're good. Pinion preload setting is probably the one I'm most unsure of. The official setting is 3 Newton meters, or some really small measurement that I have no way of measuring. Luckily, there's precedent for folks kind of winging it and using their best judgment, so that's the route that I'll take. Basically, you don't want the bearings too loose and you don't want them too tight. I'm starting with the shim that came off the old pinion. After putting it back in and torquing the bolt to 100 Newton meters, it's obvious that the bearing has too much play. The shim is too thick. The rest of this process is just straight up trial and error. Probably 20 straight minutes of swapping shims, torquing the bolt, checking the preload, and repeating. In the end, the pinion feels like this, and I would say I'm pretty happy with it. Okay, home stretch on the rear differential portion of this project. All that's left to do is set the backlash and check the gear mesh, and then we should be all done. So I'm already noticing a little binding as the diff turns in the housing. Terrafirma said that the bearing cap may need to be ground down a little, and I assume that's my problem. Yeah, you can see here how the diff carrier is contacting the bearing cap. The grinder will take care of that nicely. The bearing cap is no big deal, but this interference is unexpected. The corner of that housing mating surface is rubbing on the locker. I thought about it for a bit, and the only option at this point is to pull it all apart and grind down the housing. Had I known this was a possibility, I probably would have done it preemptively when I had the housing stripped the first time. Anyway, that's done, and I'm setting the backlash for hopefully the last time. This is very simple. The side adjustment nuts push the diff and ring gear closer or further from the pinion. The test indicator will tell us the backlash, which is hopefully between 4 and 7 thousandths. This setup is the best way I found to lock everything up for the measurement. Put the housing in a vise and clamp the pinion flange to the bench so it doesn't move. This is a weird angle, but I ended up with just under 5 thousandths of backlash. Happy with that. Now we'll use some of this Prussian blue to see the gear mesh between the ring and pinion. There's a ton of information on this process and how to read the resulting pattern out there, so I won't pretend to be an expert. I'm just happy that the patterns on both the drive and coast sides of the teeth are pretty centered and slightly toward the inside of the gear. From what I understand, this should make for a relatively quiet final drive. I've found that it helps to apply some resistance to the ring gear as you turn the pinion. That simulates an actual driving scenario and makes the mesh pattern more apparent. Maybe I don't know enough about this to recognize any problems, but this mesh pattern looks pretty good to me. It's relatively centered between the face and the flank, and slightly closer to the toe than the heel. If anyone out there is still watching and has input on this, let me know in the comments. Tapping these roll pins in locks the differential adjuster nuts in place and is pretty satisfying. Now all that's left to do is pull the pinion flange off one last time to install the oil seal and finish routing the e-locker wiring through the diff housing. This is a very light coating of black silicone. It helps the seal slide in easily and should guarantee that it doesn't leak around the outside. It also seems like a good idea to put some gear oil on the flange. With some blue Loctite, the bolt can be torqued to 100 Newton meters. Completing the wiring is just a matter of fishing the wires through the housing with the provided grommet, heat-shrinking the wires, and installing a connector. So I guess that's it for this video. An E-locker and a Land Rover differential. Stay tuned for part 2, wherein I'll put this into the disco along with that ATB and gears, then get some much needed seat time in the mountains. Thanks for watching.